This is an interview with Howard Trienens, a partner at Sidley, Austin, Brown, and Wood. It's an interview for the Lives of Lawyers project about his career as a practicing lawyer, both at Sidley and Austin, and in many other venues. Howard, let's start by having you talk about what it was like to be a student at the Northwestern Law School when you entered there.
Well, first place, it was a little different than now in that this was the first big post-war class. So almost everybody had been in the military for 2, 3, 4 years.
So what year was that?
1946.
And a pretty extraordinary class it was, too.
Well, and also an extraordinary time for the faculty. We had Walter Schaefer, who became Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, Willard Wirtz, who became Secretary of Labor, Bill Pedrick, who became Dean of the Arizona Law School. The dean at the time was Leon Green, who was a famous torts professor.
Yes.
Succeeded then by Harold Havighurst, became our dean. It was really a Homer Carey and Danny Schuyler were the leading property and trust lawyers of the time. Really an extraordinary faculty.
Yeah. Had you yourself been in the military prior to coming to
Yes.
law school?
Yeah, for a little over 3 years.
Where were you?
I was mainly in this country in downstate Illinois, Philadelphia, and Washington.
So you didn't get
I
sent
was in the
overseas?
Pentagon with General Eisenhower.
Really? How did that happen?
Well, I was working in the Pentagon, and he came back from Europe after the European affair, and I ran into him in the hall. That's how.
So, but you had been an undergraduate at Northwestern prior to that.
Yeah, but not very long. I was only got through the full freshman year. Got hauled out of here after after 1/4 of the sophomore year. I didn't have much of an undergraduate education.
And then you went into the military. And then you
Yes.
came out and went to law school.
Yes.
So you skipped the rest of your
I
undergraduate.
got a degree.
You did?
Got a degree because they gave credit for Army courses.
Really?
I got something called a Senate degree, which is as good as any other degree, I guess.
And what kind of courses did you take in the Army?
Meteorological, math, but then meteorology.
My
So I'm
goodness.
a weather forecaster.
So what made you decide or know that you wanted to be a lawyer?
I cannot remember. I don't remember before the war ever thinking about it. Nobody in the family was a lawyer. Not sure I knew a lawyer.
Uh-huh.
Somehow during the war, and I can't remember when or why, I knew by the time the war was over and I was finishing up in the Pentagon that I ought to go to law school. I didn't want to just go out and get a job somewhere. And obviously went to Northwestern.
Right, right. Well, very interesting. Did you work with any lawyers in the Pentagon?
No?
Or get involved in public policy or anything like that?
Well,
No?
we were all lobbying for the Defense Department. There was no Defense Department then.
Yes.
And we called it everybody called it the unification of the armed forces. We called it the triplification because we wanted to get the Air Force out from under the Army.
Right.
So that's
Right.
the way it ended up, Army, Navy, and Air Force.
Were you in the Air Force or in the Army?
Air Force.
Air Force.
Yeah.
So you were pretty strongly interested in
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And these rivalries continued for quite some time, even
Well,
after
well.
the unification, right?
So-called unification, yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I think Rumsfeld is probably doing a better job of bringing them together than
Uh-huh.
I think you go to Iraq, they're pretty much one group.
Right, right. So when you came, there was a pretty strict curriculum. You didn't have any choice about what you took or
No.
anything like that.
No, and it was also different in that Leon Green had just started a mandatory summer.
Uh-huh.
You went mandatory 2 summers, but then you got out in January instead of waiting until June.
So that was
And
very
everybody
tough.
was in a hurry, so that was fine.
Yeah.
There were no such things as summer employment by law firms either, so there was no
Yeah.
reason to be out.
So people really wanted to do that. And what was the job market like that you faced when you got out in January?
Well, first place, it was very different. There were no summer jobs, so the only time you recruited, or interviewed, they call it, was the Christmas vacation before you graduated.
Uh-huh.
And I never did an interview, really. I was called all down to Sidley because the chairman of the Northwestern board was chief recruiter and also chief partner, co-partner of Sidley.
Who was that?
Kenneth F. Burgess,
Uh-huh.
who was chairman of the board of trustees at Northwestern for I think 25 years.
My goodness. My goodness.
And he had an eye out at the law school for the editor of the Law Review and whoever else he wanted to pick off.
Was that you?
That was me, and so I went down and interviewed and told him no. I wanted to go to California,
Uh-huh.
and we did visit California. In fact, I interviewed various firms in San Francisco, and in order to take the bar exam and make some money while doing it, I had a faculty appointment at Stanford Law School.
You took the bar exam in California?
Would have, yeah.
Would have.
I didn't. I was going to.
Had you already taken it here?
Took it here while I was a senior,
Uh-huh.
and was admitted to the bar before I graduated.
So you could do that then? So you took it in July?
No, I took it in October.
You took it in October?
October, got passed it in December, and got sworn in January.
Oh, my goodness. Before-
Graduated later in January.
Oh, my goodness.
Can't do that anymore. I
Can't
don't
do
think.
that anymore. Right, right. So what gave you the idea you wanted to go to California?
Oh, you know, go west, young man, all that sort of thing. It was
The-
exciting.
Climate was good?
Climate was good. Play golf all year round.
Were you married at that time?
Yes, and married, had two boys, which meant you had to find some way to get a salary while you were taking the bar exam.
Absolutely.
The dean of the Stanford Law School had been a professor at Northwestern Law School. That helped.
So he recruited you to come out and teach
Be
there?
a teaching fellow, as they call it. That
Uh-huh.
was a new concept then.
Uh-huh. And so what lured you back again?
What lured me back was the fact that the Supreme Court clerkship became available
United States Supreme Court clerkship.
with the Chief Justice,
Who was at that time?
Fred M. Vinson,
Mm-hmm.
and Professor Pedrick had been his law clerk when Vinson was on the D.C. Court of Appeals. He looked to Pedrick to go find law clerks for him. And John Stevens and Arthur Cedar were a year ahead of me, and I was next. And the problem was, why should I move my family to California than to Washington? Why not just
Right.
stay here? Particularly when I went and visited the general counsel of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and he said, why would you want to come to California? All the big cases get sent to Chicago. So that took a little of the glow off of California.
Well, of course, it was a very different world in which to practice law then. People weren't jetting around on planes, and it mattered much more where you were, right?
Well, that's right. It was a long train ride to California.
Long train ride, right. I took that train ride quite a few times myself.
Well, it was interesting. I don't mind train rides, but it wasn't like today.
Wasn't like today. So did you take the clerkship with Vincent?
Oh, yes.
And how long were you in Washington?
You can't turn those things down.
Exactly. Well, how did you know you couldn't turn that down?
Well, I think faculty there would have been astounded if anybody ever did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, and in those days, the Chief Justice wanted you to stay 2 years, so we were there 2 years.
So you were living in Washington 2 years,
2 years.
and what was that experience like? Did he have any other clerks, or was it just you?
Oh, no, everybody had, now they all got 4, but then they all had 2, except the Chief Justice had 3. And one was Dan Walker, who was also recruited out of Northwestern, got called into the Navy Reserves and was replaced by Newton Minow. The other law clerk was James C. N. Paul from Penn.
The one who was later at Rutgers?
or one went to Dean and Rutgers, yeah.
Right, who was my advisor on my African homicide project. So,
Right.
so
But
these,
Jim spent a lot of time in Ethiopia, I think.
yeah, he did.
Anyway, it was an interesting group, and there were a lot of interesting law clerks for the other justices. We had Abner Mikva and Bill Rehnquist,
Mhm.
Paul Douglas's son, a lot of interesting people.
Now, what did you do as a clerk? Is it like now that you certainly weren't spending all your time on the computer, the way the clerks do now?
Oh, but fortunately, Chief Justice clerks only the Chief Justice clerk had a secretary.
Uh-huh.
So I could scribble things out and she would type it.
Did you?
Oh, in those days I didn't know how to type.
Right.
I got over that.
Good. Did you draft opinions or do the research or write memos? All of the above?
Yes.
Yes.
In fact, for Vincent, who had a mind of his own, there was no way of talking him out of something if he was set in it, but he did allow us a lot of latitude in doing the draft opinions.
Uh-huh.
The second year, I think I did them all.
Did you?
Maybe 9 or 10 of them.
Really? Tell us more about him. What kind of a man was he? What was his background? What do you think of him as Chief Justice?
Well, I thought he was terrific. History has not been kind to him.
Because?
Well, he was not a Frankfurter or a Jackson or a Black or somebody who was academically.
Mm-hmm.
He came out of Kentucky,
Mm-hmm.
was a baseball player,
Uh-huh.
politician,
What kind of politician? Senator?
congressman. He was head of the Ways and Means Committee,
Uh-huh.
appointed by Roosevelt to the D.C. Circuit,
Hmm.
pulled off the D.C. Circuit to be war mobilization.
Oh, really? And then at the end of the war, they had to
In
do
the war-
something with him, right?
Well, end of the war, he became Secretary of the Treasury
Oh,
and became a very close pal, poker-playing pal of Harry S. Truman.
so who appointed him, Truman or Roosevelt?
Truman appointed him to the Supreme Court,
Uh-huh. Was he appointed first as Chief Justice, or did he assume
right
that?
as Chief Justice.
Right as Chief
Replaced
Justice.
Stone, yeah.
Uh-huh. What was it about his character, you think, that made people appoint him to these positions of responsibility?
Well, he was very politically savvy. He was liked by everybody. He was smart. He was not a legal scholar, but he had very good judgment. And
Knew how to get the job done.
he and Frankfurter didn't get along at all.
Because?
Well, Frankfurter, every time a new judge came on, Frankfurter tried to co-opt him.
Mhm.
And he would write flowery letters about his
Mhm.
first lousy opinion and try to cozy up to him. And Vincent resented that, and Vincent went his own way, and Frankfurter realized he wasn't going to get another rubber stamp vote.
Mhm.
And so I don't think they joined each other's opinion. Well, Frankfurt didn't join a Vincent opinion for about a year and a half.
Out of spite.
You know, he would always concur, even if he
Uh-huh.
agreed with it.
Uh-huh. Did Frankfurter think he should have been Chief Justice, perhaps?
I don't know about that. I think Jackson thought he should have been,
Uh-huh.
but I don't know about Frankfurter.
There's a whole little industry of scholarship on Jackson now.
Yeah, yes.
Would deservedly, do you think?
Well, partly it's because Rehnquist has promoted him.
Uh-huh.
Rehnquist thinks Jackson's opinion in the Steele seizure case is the governing law on almost all matters.
Mm-hmm.
And he may be right.
Uh-huh. What do you think?
Well, I was on the other side of that one. I worked on the dissent.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm. Of course, the Steele seizure case was a pretty big case for Chicago, right?
well, in a sense, Inland Steel was involved, but it was a big national case.
Yeah. I remember that. So in the second year, you did a lot of opinion drafting and so on. So you came how long after Vincent was appointed?
I think 4 years.
So he'd been there a while.
Yeah.
He'd been there a while. What opinions do you remember as being particularly noteworthy during the time that you were working for Vincent?
Well, we had, I suppose the Steele seizure one is the one that's most memorable because that came up after I thought we were through. case arose in April and it was argued in May and decided late May or June.
Uh-huh.
So it was a real hustle to get that one out.
What do you mean you thought we were through?
Well, I thought we'd written all the opinions we were going to write that year.
I see.
And all of a sudden, I think it was a district judge enjoined the steel seizure.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, they skipped the Court of Appeals and landed in our lap.
Right. What about the political ramifications? Was there a lot of criticism at the court? Or people saying, you should have abstained or not taken the case or so on?
Well, they had to take the case. I think there was a general feeling that with the Korean War going on, that the court was trying to, maybe should have helped the administration some more.
Mm-hmm.
But then the strike got settled anyway, so it sort of went away as a matter of public concern.
And has it been very important as precedent, would you say, or has it?
Yeah, particularly in Rehnquist's eyes, which makes it very important as a precedent.
Of course. Right, of course.
For example, when the Iranian hostage taking,
Correct.
and then there was a question about who did what with the money that was in Algeria.
Yes.
Rehnquist relied on the steel seizure opinion of Jackson as resolving that case, strangely enough.
Because he took that opinion as a
Well,
precedent for taking jurisdiction?
No, a precedent for what are the presidential powers.
I see. Yeah.
But the other big cases, which were very much in the papers, but were legally not all that thrilling, were the communist cases, the Smith Act case,
Right.
and
Right.
the contempt of the communist lawyers for the communists.
Not the Hollywood 10.
No, this is
Out of New York?
out of New York. Yeah, they
Yeah.
were held in contempt, and
Yeah.
that case came up.
Uh-huh. Let's see, were you there for the Rosenbergs? No.
No, that was before my time.
Right, they're executed in 53, I think, right? So,
I was gone by then.
you were gone by then, right. Yeah, and the Smith Act cases, I'm sure they were very controversial. Was the court very divided about them, or was it a matter of?
Well, it was very anticlimactic. The court was divided, but you knew, those of us who were there knew exactly how it was divided.
Uh-huh.
The argument was sort of formal.
After the fact?
Yeah, everybody knew how it was coming out.
Uh-huh,
So it wasn't very exciting.
uh-huh.
Well, the exciting ones are the ones that come along and nobody knows where everybody's going to show up. Those
Yeah.
are more exciting.
Yeah, like what would be an example of one of those when you were there?
Oh, there was one bail case that came up, forget the name, but it didn't involve ideological lines, and you never knew who was going to show up where, and
Uh-huh.
it came up in a hurry. Those are interesting.
Interesting one. So you leave the court and then you go back to Chicago to Sidley, correct?
Yeah, and in the interim between not going to California and waiting for the court term to end, I was
Mhm.
at Sidley.
I see.
So I went back. I got offered a job. Carl McGowan, who was a professor here, offered me a job while I was at the court to be, I think it was assistant counsel to the Department of the Army or some strange thing.
I see.
And then also
In Washington?
in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
He was there shortly. And then he offered me the job of assistant counsel to Governor Stevenson in Illinois.
Oh, were you tempted by that?
No, I had a family and figured I better get back to work, honest living. But my co-clerk was extremely interested in it and asked if he could take it.
That was New Minnow?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's how he and Governor Stevenson got together.
So he did take the job.
He took the job.
Yeah, interesting. So you go to Sidley, and when you're there, what's the firm like? It's certainly a lot smaller than it is now.
Yeah, we all, Christmas luncheon, we'd all fit in a little private room at the Chicago Club. Must have been 40 of us, maybe.
Partners
Partners and associates.
and associates.
All the lawyers except women.
No women.
No women at the Chicago Club.
Were there lawyers who were women there?
We had a Alice Bright was a associate then and became partner when I did.
Good. So when you go there, you're associate, and how long before you're partner?
1956, which was another 4 years.
And who were the leaders at the firm then, and what did they
Well, I
do?
know, well, the first Christmas lunch I went to, Mr. Sidley,
Mm-hmm.
who was, became a named partner in 1899, was still
Oh
presiding.
my gosh. Oh my gosh.
But the real powers were Edwin C. Austin and Kenneth F. Burgess.
Tell us about them.
Austin came out of Northwestern Law School, played the piano, stayed up late, drank scotch, was a very, very able lawyer, and he had a lot of friends. He was a camp counselor, and that's where he got to know John G. Searle.
Uh-huh, really?
At undergraduate was Wisconsin, he got to know Arthur Nielsen. So he had 3 or 4 major clients,
Right.
and grew up with them, and went public with them, and but he was
When you say went public with them, you mean
when their companies developed to the point of wanting to have a public offering. Austin did it.
Uh-huh.
Austin started out as a litigator represented Western Electric in the Eastland disaster,
Uh-huh.
and he became a corporate lawyer. And then as he got older, he became a estates and trust lawyer.
Really?
So it shows you can't pigeonhole yourself into specialties.
Right. Right.
And Burgess came from a different line. He was a country lawyer in no place, Wisconsin. Represented a Burlington Railroad conductor who was accused of murder.
Really?
The Burlington Law Department liked him so well they brought him to Chicago to be in the Burlington Railroad Law Department.
Really?
And
So was that the beginning of Sidley and Austin having a substantial role in representing railroads?
it was the big time beginning. I think they represented the Santa Fe back a long time ago,
Uh-huh.
but that was he brought the railroad business. But the way he got in the firm is the firm always represented the Illinois Bell.
Uh-huh.
Young partner was the general counsel of Illinois Bell, went and died. There was nobody in the firm. Austin wouldn't do it. He had too much else. There was no one else to replace the lawyer. So they recruited Burgess out of the Burlington Law Department
Really? Oh, so he was actually working for
the railroad.
railroad then. So
He came-
why did they pick him particularly?
Well, he'd gotten to know people around town. Austin got to know him.
Mm-hmm.
He lived in Evanston, was active in Northwestern affairs, as a
Really?
matter of fact,
Uh-huh.
and co-authored a book with the head of the then Commerce School.
Really? Who was that?
I ought to remember, but I don't.
Okay, never mind. What was the book about?
It was about railroad law,
Uh-huh.
railroad law and economics.
Uh-huh. Hmm.
But Burgess became partner of the firm and general counsel of Illinois Bell at the same time,
Really? So he went
and brought the railroad practice.
and brought the railroad practice, and that was a pretty interesting practice. Let's hear some more about that. I mean, Chicago was the railroad capital of the country, if not the world, right?
Yeah, we represented almost all the western railroads, and
That being, they're mostly gone now, so let's take a look.
well, there was the the Rock Island and Santa Fe has gotten merged out of existence.
The
The
Burlington,
Missouri Pacific,
Great Northern,
Great Western,
Great Western,
Rio Grande.
uh-huh,
The one I'm trying to think of are the ones that were in bankruptcy, because the way Burgess got into this was, oddly enough, representing Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Because when the railroads went bankrupt during the Depression in the 30s, the bondholders, under the absolute priority rule, the bondholders basically owned the railroad.
uh-huh.
And so representing the bondholders in the reorganization proceeding meant you ended up owning the railroad.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's how we got into a lot of that.
Did that mean that the bondholders had to run the railroad?
They had to, they ended up with the stock,
Yeah,
so they had to appoint management.
yeah.
So they owned the railroad, then they, of course, they then got rid of the stock largely.
Mhm.
But after the war, almost all of them had come out of bankruptcy, and Burgess represented them in a big case that the government brought about whether rates during the war were excessive.
An antitrust case?
No, it was just a plain old rate case.
And what, did it go before rate board or did it go before a court?
Interstate Commerce Commission. Burgess also brought a lawyer from the Union Pacific named Douglas Smith, who I worked with more directly over the years. And we represented the Western railroads in fights with the Eastern railroads over dividing joint rates. And that sounds like a very dry subject, but it was a major battle.
I'll bet.
Lots of money and lots of interesting witnesses to put on.
I'll bet. So like tell us what the battle was about. Because
Well, you know, the simple answer is money.
yeah, like how?
Well, for example, you get a carload of lettuce going to New York from Salinas. And it goes to Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, and thence to Northwestern Railroad, then the Pennsylvania Railroad. Well, each railroad wants a share of the rate.
Right. And the grower is negotiating a single rate.
Growers have to pay a one rate.
They pay one rate.
A joint rate. In those days, a joint rate to New York. And then the railroads fight it out. And we started out representing all the West against the East, and then the Midwest wanted to split off, and we represented in what we called the Transcontinental Railroads, which Northern Pacific, Great Northern, Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, Santa Fe, Rio Grande, Western Pacific.
Now, in those days, did you have to worry about the fact if you represented one, it put you in conflict with another, or if you had an opposition with one, etc.?
Oh yeah, well, when we represented all the Western railroads and the Midwestern railroads pulled out, we resigned. And the general counsel of the Santa Fe went to the Midwestern people and said, "You can't take away my lawyer." So they consented to Douglas Smith representing the Transcontinental Roads. You can do a lot with consent.
I see. So if you had a conflict kind of situation, you could settle it by consent.
Yeah, I mean, this is the client's privilege, as it were. The client wants you to. Well, that happened lots of times. I represented the Northwestern Railroad in labor cases at a time when my partner, Stuart Ball, was representing the Rock Island fighting the Northwestern Railroad. No law firm can do that.
Now.
Well, you can, then, without consent. But the head of the Northwestern Railroad wanted us to represent him, and he didn't care if some other partner in the firm was fighting him somewhere else. What difference does that make? That's a very sophisticated view. Because there he knew all the people, and he knew what he was getting into and what he was waiving and what he wanted.
Right. He wasn't about to give
And
up his counsel.
that can be done today. You just have to write it up more today. Most of it was fairly informal then.
So after the war, the railroads were doing all right, but then did they go through a period of consolidation, some going bankrupt, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, and I got into the merger business. Sort of backwards, but while my partners were in the merger business in the West, I got in the merger business in the East, where the big initial one was Norfolk and Western merging with Chesapeake and Ohio, and I represent Norfolk and Western. It tells you somehow you get clients. The reason I got that was that in another division's fight between the North and the South, the head of the Southern Association had formerly been with the Southern Pacific out west, so he hired us to represent the South. There was no conflict there. The common enemy was the North, Pennsylvania Railroad. And at that time the Norfolk and Western was interested as a Northern Railroad, and we cross-examined their witnesses and did it in a sufficiently civil way that when they had a merger case, they hired us. They'd rather have us on their side than against them.
Sounds like a wise choice.
So we ended up representing Norfolk and Western. C&O, we were going to this is when the Pennsylvania was merging with the New York Central,
That was a big merger.
and
Were you involved in that?
we were involved in it as opponents. That unless they got out of our way, we wouldn't we wanted to stop them. I argued 2 Supreme Court cases trying to block that merger. First one we blocked it. The second one we ended up with conditions that the Supreme Court let it go through. But then when that merger collapsed, the stockholders' appetite for mergers ended, and while we won the NWC&O for the examiner at the ICC, everybody just went away and forgot it,
Really?
which is too bad.
Yeah. Huh. So, say something more about the case you argued before the Supreme Court on this merger.
Well, what we did was the commission, Interstate Commerce Commission, approved the Pennsylvania New York Central merger on the condition that the Norfolk and Western, which was then a partially owned sub of Pennsylvania Railroad, had to take over 3 small little railroads that would otherwise be crushed by the Pennsylvania and New York Central. That was the Erie, Delaware and Hudson, and Boston and Maine. And they were crummy little railroads, and Norfolk and Western didn't want them. And so we went to I think the Southern District of New York, and sued to enjoin the merger.
So you went from the ICC to Southern District.
Southern District.
No
yeah.
jury.
No, 3-judge court in those days. I think we lost it. Went to the Supreme Court within a couple of days and got a stay, 5-4. Argued it, and got it enjoined 5-4.
Got the merger enjoined.
Yeah.
Then what happened?
Then they went back and they monkeyed around with the conditions some more and reapproved it at the commission. Back to the Southern District and lost it again, and this time the Supreme Court let it go through.
Let the merger go through.
Yeah.
With any substantial changes or not that much?
Not that much, but what happened was, the way it worked out turned out to be very profitable for our client, because we ended up with these were, as I said, kind of crummy railroads, and we ended up with all the tax losses. So we filed a consolidated tax return, took advantage of all their tax losses,
Got it.
and made enough money to make it all worthwhile.
I see. So it turned out not to be such a bad thing after all.
No, but it was, it was kind of an unanticipated consequence.
Right.
Nobody planned it that way, but that's
Right.
the way it worked out.
So then did those 3 railroads go under, and that was the end of them?
Boston and Maine collapsed. The D&H got sold. That was fairly profitable. Erie went into bankruptcy. We kept filing consolidated returns and using up all their accelerated depreciation. And first time in history, a Cleveland bankruptcy judge enjoined Norfolk and Western from filing a tax return
Why?
because
Why?
we were using up all their accelerated depreciation.
What was the Cleveland Bank having to say about
No,
it?
Cleveland bankruptcy.
Oh, Cleveland Bankruptcy
judge.
Court.
Bankruptcy
Cleveland-
judge.
I see.
Hometown judge, and we took that to the 6th Circuit and got that reversed. But the idea of enjoining somebody from filing
Right.
a tax return is
Right.
a new idea. All sorts of strange things happen in this business.
So, yes, it sounds like things were pretty active then, pretty exciting. When you say that there were some interesting witnesses, who can you think of who do you remember as being particularly interesting?
Our argument in the Transcontinental Divisions case was that we ought to get more money because we had to go over mountains.
Yeah.
So we put on these operating guys telling about how tough it is to go up between Snohomish and Skyhomish in Washington, and how much snow there was,
Yes.
and how awful it was. And you learn a lot about the railroad's operations, finance. It was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
In the merger cases, you got to cross-examine president and officers of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and
Uh-huh.
this was very good, very educational.
I'll bet. Who was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad then?
Stuart Saunders, who ironically had been president of our client, Norfolk and Western. They
Was
were,
he a Philadelphia person?
no, he came out of Roanoke, Virginia, moved to
Uh-huh.
Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a strange overlap. The Pennsylvania Railroad owned most of the Norfolk and Western, controlled it. Somehow during the bankruptcy, or excuse me, during the merger, they put it into 3 different trusts, independent trusts, who voted the stock.
Oh,
And they lobbied the trust to vote against the NWCNO merger, and we got so we were fighting for really the independence of Norfolk and Western, among other things. But it was all tangled together. That was part of the interesting.
that should have
Part of
been.
it.
Why wasn't antitrust kicking in?
Well, if you got a merger approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission, it was immunized from the antitrust laws. So the
Uh-huh.
Justice Department would weigh in some degree at the commission and often in court.
Uh-huh.
In fact, they killed the merger case I wasn't in, which was Burlington Northern. Killed that for a while, and then that got finally approved. But no, Justice weighed in, but only as a participant in the commission proceedings, really.
And if they said it's okay, that was the end of the matter.
Well, there were other people, there were other interests sometimes, other railroads who said they'd be hurt. They would take it to court. Mostly big mergers ended up in court.
Is that where you first got to know Cyrus Coulter with the ICC?
Well, now that's a different line of business. As I told you, Burgess was not only the railroad lawyer, but the lawyer for Illinois Bell.
Uh-huh.
So my first assignment, while I was still teaching in law school,
At Northwestern.
yeah, the period between graduation and what I thought was going to California, I was teaching criminal law.
Mm-hmm.
But Burgess got me shanghaied out of the law school after 9:30 to go work on a case involving Chicago Medical Society, whose then president was J. Roscoe Miller.
Oh my goodness.
and
Subsequent president of Northwestern University.
And the reason Burgess was interested in that is Miller was basically the president-elect of Northwestern, but
Oh,
still
really? Uh-huh.
was still head of the Chicago Medical Society, Chicago Medical Society, and at that time the Antitrust Division was investigating medical societies for monopolizing hospitals.
Really? Really?
And so I was checking all the minutes and everything. Burgess did not want his president-elect to get indicted.
Certainly not.
Wouldn't look good.
Would not look good. Would not look good.
Any event, that went away. But while I was there, there was a major Illinois Bell rate case going on, which I got involved in. And it was in subsequent Illinois Commerce Commission rate cases that I got to know Cyrus Coulter.
Who's cropped up before in these interviews because Judge Strayhorn said that it was because he knew Cyrus Coulter in the Army that he decided to go to law school.
Oh, good.
He was stationed in Italy, and Cy Coulter was there, and he said, well, Cyrus Coulter said, I didn't know any lawyers, but Cyrus Coulter persuaded me that going to law school was something I could do.
No, Coulter was a wonderful person.
So wonderful.
Yeah.
So wonderful.
A lot of interests. He was a trustee of the Chicago Symphony. He was active in a lot of things.
A writer, very fine, wonderful writer.
A writer, and then became an English professor here at Northwestern.
Yeah. And a very distinguished writer whose books will live a long time, I think.
Oh, he was remarkable, and he was proud of the fact he was on the Illinois Commerce Commission for many years and was appointed and reappointed by, I think, 4 different governors of 2 different parties.
Is that right? So, what was he, a commissioner or counsel to them?
Commissioner.
Commissioner. And he didn't have another job. That was his job.
That was his job.
That was his job. Now, would you just say that Burgess was what we would now call a mentor to you, someone who took you under his wing?
Yeah, no, he was very much so.
Uh-huh.
Very much so. He and Douglas Smith both, but particularly Burgess.
Mm-hmm.
I'm blessed to have Burgess and Smith, and then a lawyer a officer at Illinois at AT&T, and Jack Searle. I mean, those people have been very good to me. Story goes way, way back to the 1860s.
Uh-huh.
The firm represented something called the Western Electric Manufacturing Company, which made telegraph signals and all. And when the telephone was invented, they started manufacturing telephones. They were acquired by Western Union.
Right.
Western Union was acquired by AT&T, and in the process, the firm stayed with each new owner.
Mm-hmm.
And so the firm has represented what is all called the Bell system since 1860s.
Oh my goodness.
That's how Burgess and the firm and Illinois Bell were together.
Uh-huh.
And we represented Illinois Bell, and then when AT&T had a local matter in Chicago, we represented AT&T. And then when AT&T had a major problem in 1960,
Mm-hmm.
61, we represented AT&T down at the FCC.
Washington.
And by coincidence, Newt Minow had become the chairman.
Of the
Of the
FCC?
FCC.
Oh my goodness.
So we represented them, and I figured it was a good idea not to, I was too close, I didn't want to embarrass them. So when I helped prepare a case, and Douglas Smith went over and argued it, and I waited in the hotel to see how it came out. But that led to a lot of AT&T matters, including big-time rate cases at the FCC,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which I tried.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1974, AT&T got hit by a major antitrust case.
Right.
Started with MCI versus AT&T here in Chicago, which was
Really? Uh-huh.
very fortunate because that meant we got in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
Then later that year, the government sued them.
Uh-huh.
And
For antitrust.
I think that's one of the few cases where I went out of my way to try to get the case. I went to New York and told them I wanted it.
Uh-huh. Why did you want that case?
Big.
Big.
No, that was that was a bet the company case.
Yeah.
There were 40, not only MCI, but 40 other major private cases.
Mm-hmm.
This was the biggest piece of legal business in the country at the time. And it was exciting. This was a major affair.
Yeah.
But so we had a team in Chicago, Washington, and New York that worked on it. And I was basically in charge of it. And then when their general counsel retired, they asked me to come to New York and be their general counsel, which I was for 6.5 years.
So you take it, you get it. How many years? How many lawyers? I mean, how many cities? It goes on for a long time, right?
Goes on from 74 till 84, 10 years.
Dominating your life during this period.
Very much so.
And how many other lawyers?
Well, it's hard to count because we had Sidley lawyers in Chicago, Washington, New York. We had Dewey Ballantine lawyers in New York and Washington.
Mm-hmm.
We had all of them a lot of them in Washington. Preparing for the trial, and the trial started in 82, somewhere in there,
82 in Washington?
in Washington.
This is the antitrust trial.
Meanwhile, the MCI trial had come and gone.
In Chicago?
In Chicago, the Southern Pacific Sprint trial was on and off in Washington. There were all trials going on all over the place.
And were you the chief litigator at the
Yeah,
Washington one?
I did not participate personally in the trials of any of them.
Not even the Washington one?
No, I ended up arguing the approval of the consent decree twice. I argued the appeals from the Litton case, and I argued the appeal from the MCI case twice.
And why were you not doing the trials?
Can't do everything.
Can't do everything.
An appeal, you can work on the briefs and other things at the same time. You can prepare the argument. The argument only takes an hour.
Yeah.
Where a trial is, totally consuming for
Consuming,
6
yeah.
months or something.
Yeah.
You can't be general counsel and worrying about 8 other cases at
Right.
the same time.
Right, right.
And meanwhile, I was trying to keep track of Northwest Industries and Searle, enough, and say nothing of the law firm.
Yes. Were you managing partner then for the law firm?
I was chairman of the executive committee for 17 years, including all the years when the AT&T case was going on.
So chairman of the executive committee was in effect the person who was the chief executive officer, right?
I think that's right. We had another title called the chairman of the management committee, which I would call perhaps the chief operating officer.
Uh-huh.
Those are not precise, but generally.
Yeah.
No, I was very fortunate. Blair White and Newton Minnow were back here in Chicago looking after the day-to-day matters
For the firm,
of the firm.
yeah. Now again, firm management was a different proposition then than it is now, right?
I don't know. We had hired a professional manager.
Uh-huh,
By that, who did everything but the legal side, you know, the
uh-huh.
staff hiring and all the support work. So
Mhm.
I'm not sure it was a whole lot different.
No, it's still the big decisions about guiding the firm, what kind of a practice you wanna have.
That's all by the management committee, executive committee. And
Yeah. So what kind of volume of business are we talking about for this AT&T case? Millions of dollars, right?
yeah, and the only worrisome thing was there were times when it got to be about 20% of the firm's revenues.
Yes.
And I didn't like that in the sense that you don't want to be too dependent on one client.
Right, right.
You know, and after it was over, then what?
Exactly.
Although it turned out that there was enough going on in regulatory matters, consent decree, fights with the operating companies,
Mhm.
FCC matters, that even to this day it's keeping some people busy,
Yeah.
both in Washington and Chicago.
So so it was never over, in some sense.
No, but the divestiture made a change of life. I mean, it turned Illinois Bell from a client to an adversary,
Uh-huh,
which is too bad in a way.
uh-huh.
And no, it was different. And we spent a lot of time for years fighting about the consent decree. The operating companies chafed under the restrictions, but they were part of the deal.
Mhm.
And by the time AT&T was separate, they were protected by some of those conditions. And so we ended up fighting the operating companies, our former children.
Did you at a time go and actually act as counsel for A&T or?
AT&T?
Yeah.
I was the vice president and general counsel for 6 3/4 years.
So, and during that time, you were no longer at Sidley?
Oh no, I was still
You were still at
partner,
Sidley?
and I was still chairman of the executive.
Ah, now how did that work out? Did you have to go and actually be at the headquarters of AT&T? No.
Yeah?
Yes?
Oh yeah. Well, I had an office there.
Uh-huh,
Kept my home here, had an apartment in New York.
uh-huh.
They originally wanted me to just drop the law firm, and I wasn't willing to do that
Mhm.
for a lot of reasons. One of which is they had a 65 mandatory retirement age. Then what do you do?
Yeah, exactly, right.
So I insisted on doing that. There was a grand tradition of doing that. Burgess had done it.
Uh-huh,
Mr. Sidley had done it. Sidley was the general counsel of Western Electric in New York at the same time he was chairman of the firm. So I said, what's new?
good, good. So you
And there was-
persuaded them?
and I didn't regard it as any conflict. First place, I had nothing to do with the billing on either side. Somebody else billed out of Chicago, somebody else reviewed the bill in New York. I just had nothing to do with that. And my theory was that I was the lawyer for AT&T, and whether I was inside or outside and how I
Didn't
got
matter.
paid didn't make any difference
Yeah, yeah. So that was a big part of your life spent with
for that
AT&T.
period, yeah.
Yeah.
And I tried to keep active at Searle, and I also kept active at Northwest Industries.
Well, since we're sitting in the Searle building, let's talk some more about John Searle and who he was and how your relationship with him.
Well, that was kind of strange. As I said earlier, Austin was a camp counselor to John G. Searle, and they kept together. he counseled Jack Searle all through early days of the company. Jack did not found Searle. He was the third generation.
Mhm.
But that time it was run out of a garage in North Chicago. And then came a number of drugs, including the birth control pill, and all of a
Right.
sudden
Right.
it took off.
If it's third generation, why is it still in a garage in Chicago?
No, it was then.
Was
Why-
then?
Then?
Yeah.
No, because, all they were doing was punching pills of sort of generic, aspirin, things like
Uh-huh,
that. It was
uh-huh.
it's not a proprietary, they didn't have any proprietary big-time drugs, they had no research.
Uh-huh, did nothing.
But Jack Searle built that company
Mhm.
from essentially nothing.
Mhm.
But Austin was his pal. Austin was on the board. This is the good old days of boards. It was a wonderful corporate governance. I got on the board because Austin insisted that he ought to retire at, I forget, 65 or 70.
Mhm.
Searle didn't want him to.
Mhm.
Dan was coming along, and so basically, I guess Bob Foote, who was Austin's son-in-law and a partner in the firm and done a lot of Searle work, was the natural successor.
Mhm.
But he was older, and Dan wanted somebody his age. So he interviewed 3 of us at the firm. And you'll have to ask him why I got it.
So you didn't know him before then?
Never met him before.
Never met him before. Well, it sounds like also the firm relationship with Northwestern goes all the way back, goes so far back.
Well, certainly back with Burgess, back to the early 30s.
Yeah.
And back to the days of the discussed merger with the University of Chicago.
Yes, when was that again?
Middle 30s,
Middle 30s.
middle of the Depression.
A road not taken.
Yeah. But I had known Rocky Miller by working on before he was elected president, by working with Burgess. So Rocky was all for this.
And Rocky what was his relationship with Burgess again?
Well, Burgess picked him out of the medical school to be president of
Right.
Northwestern. That's his
Uh-huh.
relationship.
And Burgess was chairman of the board
Chairman of the board then, yeah.
Uh-huh. What a position you yourself held for 10 years.
Yes, after Burgess, Dixon, Swiner, Ayers. Yeah.
Mhm.
But I was on that board, and that was when the first product liability cases were started. So I got mixed up with that and got one of my partners to front that. And we fought all the product liability cases
Mhm.
at the beginning. Jack Searle took them as a personal affront,
Really?
and we won them. We used to beat them in
Uh-huh.
third cases.
So these were the drug product liability
These were birth
cases.
control pills,
I
basically.
see, I see.
And finally, the volume got such that they started settling them just for cheap, somewhere they were cheaper than
Mhm.
trying them.
Mhm. And I think the jury's still out on some of that, in terms of the science, right?
No, I think that's pretty much passé now.
Is it?
They're on to other drugs now.
Hmm.
But those were the primitive days of corporate governance. The New York Stock Exchange had a rule that you ought to have an audit committee.
Uh-huh.
So Rocky was the head of the audit committee, and I was on it. Then I became head of the audit committee, which is absolutely unthinkable today. You can't have
Yes.
your lawyer be on the board, even, much less on the audit committee.
Right, right.
But you get to meet a lot of interesting people. The young man from Minnesota came down to be the Arthur Anderson account man, named Dwayne Kohlberg, ended up running Arthur Anderson.
Right.
But the Searle Company is a very, very good company. It got in trouble for the wrong reason. It got in trouble because Jack Searle thought that relations with the FDA is a matter of medical science and doctors,
Mhm.
and the lawyers keep out of it.
Mhm.
And that's the way he operated. And that isn't the way the FDA operated. And
Uh-huh.
they got in trouble over some rat test that they shouldn't have gotten in trouble with. And the Kennedy subcommittee had hearings and made Searle look bad.
And the consequence was?
Consequence was the stock went from 39 to 13. That's
Oh
the
my.
consequence.
Yeah.
At which point they hired Rumsfeld,
Oh, really? Then what happened?
and the stock went to 65.
Yeah.
But that took a while.
That
It
took a while.
In any
Well, what-
event, I got off that board mainly because I really didn't think lawyers ought to be on boards. 'Cause I was on the Donnelly board, which I tried to avoid, but they insisted. I got off of that because they printed telephone directories, so I had an excuse to get off. I believe lawyers should be on boards in the sense that they ought to pick somebody who goes to board meetings, participates in all board events like retirement parties and
Yeah.
social and retreats.
Yeah.
The way I did it at Northwest Industries and at AT&T. Never a member of the board, because then they knew if you were talking, you were being a lawyer. You weren't trying to
Yes.
be a board member or a
Yes.
business judgment.
Right.
But
Right.
that was a much more sensible arrangement, I thought.
And now, well, tell us about how did you plan your exit from AT&T? At a certain point, you knew it was
Well,
coming to an end.
Well, once we got the divestiture out of the way, and got through a year or so that, I told Chairman Charles L. Brown that I ought to get out of there, and he pleaded with me to stick around as long as he did, which was the middle of '86. So I got out the same time he did. So I got out ahead of the mandatory retirement age, but not much. But it was, there wasn't any hardship living in New York. They kind of spoiled you. You got your own car, your own helicopter, your own everything. I say your own, I mean the helicopter whenever you needed to get to New
Right.
Jersey.
Right.
So you did get spoiled somewhat.
I'm sure. What about your own involvement with Northwestern? When did that start, aside from, I know you were teaching, right? When
Well,
you
I was
were-
teaching, and then I was working with Dr. Miller before he became president. I was not very active in alumni affairs. I was on something called, it was really a junior John Evans club for people who didn't have that much money. I was on that for a year or two, but then I really sort of got out of it. I had too much else going on. But then when I got on the Searle board, Jack put me on the Northwestern board.
Oh, really?
Because he had Zweiner and Ayers and himself, and he had put Dan on a year earlier, I think. So I was part of the then 1967 youth movement, I guess.
Right, the Searle coup.
So that really put me back in the. And then I was active in varying degrees. I was on the presidential search committees, and
You were on the presidential search committee, which picked Tom Ayers.
well, that was easy. No, the one that picked Stroats.
Oh, okay.
This goes way back.
Right.
The one that picked Stroats. Ayers was Stroats was. I'm talking about president of the university, not president of the board.
No, that's what I'm talking about too.
Yeah. Oh, it was Stroats, and then I had worked with Ayers that discussed when Stroats would step down,
Yeah.
and then on the search committee for Weber,
Right.
and then the search committee for some guy named Bienen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
So hang on. So you were on the search committee for 3 presidents. Whoa. And then you were chairman of the board yourself for.
from 85 to 90, January 1, 96, or I should say December 31, 95. We're out at the Rose Bowl, and it changed.
Right.
And I've stayed active since then, but the degree of activity during the time I was in New York, in fact, Ayers held on another year and a half to let me make my escape from New York.
That was good. Yeah. It's interesting. So often young lawyers go to law firms and they're told get involved in not-for-profit institutions, and they often don't have any experience with that or know how to do it. Yet, so often for lawyers, it is a big part of their life and a big part of their business associations. And it seems like it's been that for you, not just Northwestern.
Yeah, but I sort of fell into it. But you can get active in it. There's a young lawyer in our firm now over at MacArthur Foundation who got active at the Juvenile Protective Association, which is not one of the. It's a very important, but not one of the big name ones.
Yes.
And you know, if you get active in it and give a little, not, you don't have to give huge amounts of money, but give
No.
some money and
Right.
participate in the activities.
Get involved in the
Yeah.
get involved in overseeing.
Yeah,
So often they do seem to need some overseeing.
that's right. There are university boards. There's enough museum boards around. There's
Plenty.
a lot of things to do.
Yeah, a lot. Well, you know, let's finish with with the question I started with, which, what do you think makes a good lawyer? What makes a lawyer respected?
Well, who knows? The most important thing going on at a law firm is you got to remember it's self-perpetuating.
Yeah.
It is not like the advertising firms who went corporate and public in the
Right.
30s and 40s, and therefore the partners don't own it.
Right.
This time the partners own it in succession,
Yeah.
and when they retire, the younger people
Yeah.
come into the ownership. Therefore, recruiting is exceedingly important, and we spend a lot of time. I was head of the recruiting for a year or two. Spent a lot of time going to the law schools. The best student in the country could be anywhere.
Yes.
The depth, however, is at Harvard, Yale, Northwestern,
Right.
Michigan, Chicago.
Right.
So that's where we get more numbers.
Yeah.
But the key is to pick off the law review people, to pick off the law clerks,
Yeah.
encourage them to be law clerks,
Yeah.
work very hard at the, Carter Phelps was very hard at recruiting at the Supreme Court. And we like to recruit at the Supreme Court for Washington, but also for Chicago and Los Angeles and elsewhere.
And that's still true. Right.
Because you know they've got a certain degree of talent to start with,
Mm-hmm.
and they also know how to work.
Mm-hmm.
Because on the law review and a clerk job, you gotta
You gotta work.
have a work ethic of
Yeah.
sorts. So getting them in, and then getting them in the firm where they're happy in this, and the way to keep them happy is to give them challenging work.
Right.
And people just emerge from that.
Yeah.
Some do it, some don't.
Right.
And then some of them don't like the practice. They don't like catering to clients or answering their phone calls. So they go to become law professors or assistant general counsel someplace. But
Right.
it sort of filters out over the years. But you have to keep at that one. That is a secret of the future of the law firm.
And the organization of the law firm doesn't really change that, right?
Well, and we haven't changed that much. There's all this talk about how commercialized the business is and how the public relations and marketing and all, but I've been fortunate in that I don't see it's that much different. It's the way we practice. Turn out Tom Cole into a number of corporate boards, and based on his performance, he gets other assignments.
Yeah.
Chuck Douglas goes out and tries cases and wins them,
Right.
and people want him back.
Right.
And that's the
Right.
way. That's the best way to
Get clients.
get clients and keep
Yeah.
clients.
Yeah. How long does it usually take for you to make up your mind about somebody at the firm?
Well, if you have to think about that, I mean, it just sort of happens. Some people, 2 or 3 years, you know they're going to make it, and then there's people at the margin, and those are tough decisions sometimes.
Yeah. Very hard.
But when they're that big, you know, there's a lot of volume, and you need a lot of different kind of people. Minnow says, you know, you can't have a symphony orchestra with all violinists, all
Right.
first violins. You got to have a couple of oboe players. So we got to have people who know how to deal with pension trusts. You got to have people who know how to write wills,
Right.
and each niche has its own satisfactions of doing a good
Right.
job and the client satisfaction.
Right. Right.
And it sort of takes care of itself in a sense.